everyone. I think it's going to be a really fascinating and informative conversation. I especially want to thank our partners here at Stanford for hosting us, and to Corby Kummer, the Executive Director of Food and Society at the Aspen Institute, who's been our amazing partner. Hi, Corby. Our amazing partner on the Conversations on Food Justice series. It's been a really special treat to partner on this. At Share Our Strength, we have the tremendous privilege of working with some of our nation's most exceptional innovators and paradigm changers, many of whom are in the room with us today. We are proud to bring together people and organizations who are working across sectors to address some of our most pressing challenges when it comes to food, health, and economic inequity. And as our world continues to change, we find ourselves at a critical inflection point as a society. Some of you, likely many of you, given the work that you do, may be aware that the annual Census Bureau report released in September revealed that child poverty more than doubled in the United States last year. That's the largest single year increase on record. And we know why. This can largely be attributed to the expiration of federal food assistance, housing, and healthcare programs that kept so many families afloat during the pandemic. And as our planet continues to warm and place even greater strain on our food systems, the United Nations Panel on Climate Change reminds us that we have the technology that we need to solve climate change, but that it is our systems and infrastructure that prevent us from implementing them effectively. So in short, we have the answers, we have the tools that we need to build a better future. The question for all of us is whether or not we choose to use them. And of course, we know that advancing equity through innovation must be a deliberate effort, and one that requires thinking differently about expertise, systems, and what progress looks like. And that's part of what all of our leaders today are doing on a daily basis. So we are so pleased to bring this community together, which includes hundreds of people who are tuning in virtually. So we're so excited to have all of you in the room and virtually together to have this very conversation. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce David Grusky, who is the director of Stanford's Center on Poverty and Inequality. David, thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm really pleased to welcome you to our event on food justice in the 21st century, an event that the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality is presenting in partnership with Share Our Strength and Aspen Institute. So this isn't your usual food justice event. We're going to be stepping back and providing a big picture portrait of the new strains that our food system is facing in the 21st century. And the simple point here is that we're moving into this poly-crisis world in which there are unprecedented systemic challenges like crisis in government, climate change, disruptions in supply chain, and many more. And if we don't get the job done, the burden of those challenges are going to be borne disproportionately by those who are already bearing the burden of immense racial and class inequities. So yeah, we're going to be talking about the challenges, but that's just our starting point. We're also going to be talking about the amazing people and organizations who are stepping up and doing all they can to meet those challenges. So we'll talk about data-informed innovations, safety net innovations, tech innovations, and more. So before we get started, I've been told to share a few housekeeping items. If you're on Zoom, and I'm told we have 400 people signed up on Zoom. If you're on Zoom and you want to pose a question, you can do so through Zoom's Q&A button. If you're in person, you can pose a question with those who are running mics here. And the last 25 minutes of this event will be devoted to any comments, questions that attendees want to pose. So welcome. Let's get to it. I'm going to turn it over to the wonderful, amazing Stanford alum, Lillian Singh, Senior Vice President, Family Economic Mobility. Welcome.
Thanks for joining us today. And I just want to start by thanking the Aspen Institute and our leadership who continues to carry this message forward, and particularly this topic I don't see him in the room.
Grateful to you.
Oh. Thank you. Thank you so much for the work that we're doing together. And I also just want to start by recognizing the land in which we sit on right now in this moment, the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people, consistent with our values. So I'm just excited about being able to be back on campus. We call it the farm, and I'm excited to share our strength in this moment. A part of this conversation is demonstrating our commitment to addressing the root causes of hunger. We have a fantastic panel that I am excited to introduce here in a moment. And during the prep call, y'all, I'm gonna tell you, I was a little bit of a mess because like the intellectual capital that's sitting next to me, I was a little overwhelmed, but I got myself together. And in getting myself together, we're gonna be talking about the most I was most impressed by the intersectional lenses that each one of our panelists are advancing to really unlock the complexities around food insecurity. I just want to start off by saying that I think food insecurity is an economic issue, and we're going to talk about that intersectionality through different lenses on our panel today. And also, I'll also name is cost burdenship around food is something that we can solve in this country. So I'm so excited that Trevor has also decided to join us to help us understand the role of technology and reducing the costs that families actually face in assessing food in place. So let's jump in. So I have the easy part of just asking the questions today, right? To all of our panelists. So the first question that we want to just kind of explore, since we're here to talk about food insecurity, which we believe is an equity issue, what does inclusive innovation around food security look like for each of you? So in answering that question, if you can also just say your name, the organization which you're representing with us today, and what does this look like for you?
Hi, everybody. Good morning. So delighted to be with you all. My name is Francesca Costa. I use she, her pronouns. I work at Code for America, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that partners with government to basically leverage the power of technology and human-centered design to make our public services more equitable and to basically alleviate poverty. So really delighted to be with you all today. I think the key word that comes to me is really integration. I think we've talked about how you can't talk about food insecurity as an isolated issue. I worked at food banks previously, and nobody ever just came in with concerns about hunger, right? It was like the rent, the childcare, how you're going to piece it all together. So I think recognizing that people have multiple needs and making sure people can access the multiple benefits that they're eligible for in one fell swoop is critical. Our organization worked really closely in the state of Minnesota to build an application that allows people to apply for 9 benefits in about 15 minutes. It's a multilingual application, mobile responsive, so people who use a smartphone to access the internet can access those services. And technology is really powerful in that you can really tailor the experience. So, you know, I don't have to give the same 20-page application to every person. We can ask some key questions, figure out, you know, what questions are necessary for follow-up, and then take that route of personalization. So really just bringing all of the things that we know about technology that we use in our day-to-day lives to bring ease and simplicity to accessing critical safety net services. Thank you. We can go with Deborah.
Oh, we're just gonna open it. Deborah Gorman, I'm CEO and president of the Green Lining Institute. And actually, we're celebrating our 30th anniversary. So we've been doing racial and economic equity work for 30 years. And in the last about 10 to 15 years, we've both also lifted up climate equity. And we're one of the few organizations that's at the intersection. And you can imagine the innovation. Well, the word that I would use is intersectionality for sure. It's used a lot, but in this case, you know, nobody is living, the quote is a single issue life. So we can't focus on single issues. So if you start to talk about, you know, food insecurity or just being hungry, you know, it's just, you just say, I'm hungry, and you sit with that, you realize it is a myriad of things that come into where you need to have an impact and what you need to change or adjust. And so, you know, at Green Lining, when we are looking at what is, you know, economic security look like? There's a lot of systems change that we are trying to engage. A lot of it, really stems around closing the racial wealth gap. So we unapologetically see race as a core determinant. And greenlining was the antidote for redlining. And so redlining was the practice of circling, marking communities for based on race and disinvestment. And so you perpetuate that, and you can see that we now have new frontiers of redlining happening based on the old premises. And while those things have been banned since, fair housing was 1966, and then we had more sort of legislative, the systems, the institutions, the behaviors persist. And so, want to get into the conversation of what that looks like and how greenlining tries to approach solutions on that.
Sarah?
I'm Sarah Kimmerlin. I'm the Executive Director at the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality, so work closely with David. And we're just so excited to be part of this event, and it's been such a pleasure to plan this event with Mr. Arstrake and Aspen and all of you, so it's a pleasure to be here. In terms of the key, I'll be quick here, but two key things that I think are really important in terms of thinking about inclusive innovation. So one is making sure that we're thinking about food security within the broader context of economic security. And this really ties into a lot of lines of research at the Center on Poverty and Inequality. So I look forward to getting into more of that later in this conversation. And then secondly, really leaning into data to be able to uncover who is being included and who's being excluded across different innovations and across new approaches to addressing food security and economic security more broadly. And I think that's a topic we'll be talking about more as well. So so great to be here.
Thank you for hosting us. We appreciate you, sir.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Fukumori. I use he, him pronouns. I'm wearing a bunch of hats today. Officially, I'm here on behalf of PolicyLink. We are a national nonprofit based here in Oakland, California, an equity-driven think tank. But specifically, my projects here, and projects plural, are the National Equity Atlas and our local version, the Bay Area Equity Atlas. And both projects are data hubs that are meant to package publicly available data in ways that change makers, whether that's public officials, nonprofits based in communities, advocates, can utilize that data to drive equity and change in their own spaces. Really thinking about it as a network capacity building function. And I want to offer a caveat that actually the equity atlases do not directly involve data on food security. And so I'm here today to really think, as other colleagues have mentioned here today, around the multi-institutional, multi-dimensional aspects that form the phenomenon of food insecurity, or really the aspirations towards food justice. And in that regards, I think we can think about the ways that our research data model, or the way that we want to pursue knowledge production itself, can be brought to bear on these same questions. And I think in that regards, when I think of inclusive innovation, I want to really think about the balance of the ground up and the bird's eye view together. Really understanding, to Sarah's point about the importance of data from a structural level to understand who's being excluded and included, but then also making sure in terms of inclusivity that we are directly engaging and involving people with lived experiences, people who are hungry, people who are working in direct services on the ground with people suffering from hunger, and making sure that those folks are also directly involved in systems design, in making sure that we are designing practices and processes that are going to work for the people who need them.
And Trevor.
Yeah, so my name is Trevor Thompson, and I am the president of a company called TerraClear, and very lucky to be one of the Aspen Food Fellow leaders. And that my experience with just briefly to show my appreciation has been with Aspen Institute has been the most broadening of my career, in the sense that the work that I'm focused on is very much on-farm technology. This is like, in Iowa and Idaho and North Dakota. And it's much different than a lot of the themes that we're talking about today. And I feel very grateful to be a part of this conversation. And you think that the warm-up call was intimidating for you, try to be exposed to a lot of these new issues. And I'm very thankful for that, being able to kind of jump into different disciplines. So how do we think about equity? The work that we do is very much, again, on farm. And for us, it's about understanding all the stakeholders that are involved in growing food today. And our job is to make that experience more profitable and more sustainable for these growers so that we can produce more food. But that's not just the relationship with the farmer who's going to pay for this product. It's understanding, who is working on that farm, the H2A employees that are out there, in our case, picking up rocks and weeding and doing very uncomfortable jobs, understanding their experience and how we can improve that. And then there's this broader, issue of just being a part of the effort to drive the cost of food down. It's quite remarkable. If you look at just a couple stats. So in 1801, let's take wheat. It was about 10 minutes of labor per kilogram of wheat that was produced. 100 years later, that was cut in half. So in 1901, it was about 5 minutes of labor per kilogram of wheat. In 2023, it's 2 seconds of labor. And so there has been this massive improvement in the way that we, not just wheat, but all types of food. And I think we're at a really fascinating point today where with the advent of AI and the ability to take copious amounts of data and use that really systematically and carefully, hopefully, my big hope is that there's another inflection point where the cost of food production drops again. And I'm missing one giant piece of this. The stakeholder that we haven't mentioned is the earth and the environment and all the other things that I think farmers sometimes get a bad rap for not caring about. But they do. The ones that we interact with do. They just don't know how to improve their systems. And it is a constant. Of course, I don't want to spray chemicals on my field. Of course, I don't want to, have a high carbon signature. But it's up to investors and I think technologists and entrepreneurs to help them chart that path to a better way of farming. And that's a real important part of what we do.
So yeah, solving food insecurity is going to be an easy thing, right? But what we're going to dive into together is we're going to explore what are the individual costs of not solving food insecurity, the communal costs of how we have to think about solving this issue, what is the power of data in influencing where we go, and finally, the power of technology, because there's a huge gap right now in our country in actually investing in technological solutions to address this. So it's going to look like I'm going right down the row again. Maybe I am a little bit.
Or maybe we go in reverse.
So we'll start with Francesca to talk to us about the work that you're doing. You alluded to this in your opening remarks around the individual cost, right, of federal safety net programs and their inability sometimes to necessarily reach those who are furthest from justice but need them the most. So what does that actually look like for a family that's trying to assess SNAP? And in California, CalFresh, I'm the recipient of SNAP growing up in Los Angeles. So I'm very familiar with the process. I know it's changed quite a bit, but can you just talk to us about what is that individual cost to that family that's experiencing the system trying to assess food?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So I think we all make trade-off decisions in our lives all the time, right? We're like, is it worth it for me to do this? Is it worth my time? Is it worth my money? And people who are in poverty are no different. In fact, they're probably making those calculations a lot more often because there's a scarcity of a budget. So, just because you are low income doesn't mean you have more time to process, work on applications or all these things. In fact, you probably have less because you're taking the bus, you're not able to buy your way out of these frictions that a lot of us do on our day to day. Historically, applying for benefits has been, I would say, a little insensitive to how much time it takes people to get through the process. Really, quick to ask somebody to come in and drop off a document when there's a perfectly feasible technological way to get a document to an office without having to go in person. At Code for America, we want to flip that on its head. And actually, it's funny, people have said you're helping people. And I kind of push back against that. I think of us more as like janitors who are cleaning the pipes so people can just flow through without friction. That these systems just work, right? That it's not going to take you a million hours to figure out how to apply so much that you give up, right? Because that's the reality for a lot of people. So really, we want to make the process as easy as possible for people to get the right information at the right time, for them to be able to fill out these applications easily. A lot of Americans have a smartphone now, like 97% of Americans have a smartphone, but 15% of Americans are smartphone dependent. So you don't have a desktop. So when you get to a website that doesn't work on a mobile phone, you are X'd out of that process. So really thinking about all these different ways we can support people making the system. One resource that I would love to plug that will be in the follow-up guide is our field guide, a benefits field guide, which evaluates different application systems across the country in every state. are these systems integrated? Are they available online? How long does it take to get through them? There's a huge array and discrepancy. And really what this comes to is, what are the policies? How are they implemented? And how they are implemented is actually like how people experience them. Just a couple examples of like getting right information at the right time when it comes to renewing your benefits. This is a process that sometimes people will miss, and then they'll get to the grocery store, they'll have a cart full of food and realize that they don't have their benefits for the next month. So, a hugely problematic moment. In Connecticut, we were able to increase the rate of renewals by 6.3% just by sending a text message and referring people to a system that already existed. And over the next year, that will result in $9.5 million in benefits for people who need them. So just really trying to, again, flip the process on its head, trying to have our North Star be the most seamless experience. In technology, we talk about automation a lot. Like you talk to any engineer, they want to automate a task. Like we don't want to do it. And so how can we get as close to automation as we're allowed to get in a policy space, to having people just be able to keep their benefits without having to lift a finger?
Thank you for that. And Ryan and Deborah, this question is really helping us in our audience and our participants online understand the communal cost. And in our opening remarks, you all shared things saying that food insecurity is, an intersectional issue. No one lives a single issue life. It's a very complex challenge. So what we want to explore right now is help us understand that larger ecosystem of food insecurity. And Deborah in particular, I know you alluded to this a little bit earlier in your remarks about redlining. So help us understand the ecosystems in which people live and how larger, more complex economic issues impact a person's ability to access food in place.
I appreciate that perspective. So I'm going to stick with Francesca's. So she's keeping the pipes clean and functioning. We're looking at where the pipes are going. Right? Like if I get in the pipe and you sweep all this data and there's automated decision making, you're going to go down certain pipes, and some aren't even going to get into the pipe. It's like you're not in the pipeline right now. You showed up with your food basket. You're not. And so we get up a little higher and we look at the automated decision making. So we call that, tech equity. So what are the algorithms? What are the biases in those algorithms? So that you can qualify for the pipelines. And it turns out that when you are scraping, loads of data, that data is biased, right? So if there are profiles on what it takes to be eligible for SNAP, and that it is not inclusive of, that community, well, you're not going to be eligible, or you're going to be turned off. And so that's where it's like, how are the pipes set up to service the community? And when do you get either, disconnected or pushed out of a system? So that's the system institutional part. That it's like, you have to really be careful when you're talking about let's automate. I agree, it creates speed and expediency. It creates accessibility, but that can be so flawed. And a lot of the automated decisions, I think maybe that people could relate to is like the criminal justice systems, right? That they were saying who's eligible, who's eligible for parole, what are the fees and fines? Well, that's all based on historical data, and that historical data was based on the system and processes, and frankly, the judges. And even if you look at when you are giving a judge the decision, they still have the discretion to either apply the term of the sentence or the fines and fees, and that's biased. So they have the data, and the judge will see the person, and the judge will say, well, I will give 6 years, and I look at you, and I will give 3. So the automation part, yes, but I think there's how are we working through the system, and what does that data look like? And at the intersection of the climate part, so there are tools. So we were working with the EPA, California EPA. There's a resource called Cal EnviroScreen. And at first it was to look at health determinants in your community, asthma, diabetes, and what was the correlation with the climate and where you live. And then it quickly went from like 9 determinants to 22, because then we added what's called the social determinants, right? So it mattered what was your education level, what was occupation, and so now, you know, childbirth rates and weights. So now there's 21 determinants under an environmental assessment that decides what the distribution of resources is. So it just, you know, so as much as we look at the data and the innovation, there's a holistic perspective on then what does that mean to get, you know, in this case, food on the table. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Deborah. Well, I'm going to give it over to Ryan. I appreciate the hat that you're wearing. And you said that you all don't necessarily collect food insecurity data, but the work that you do at PolicyLink, you know, with the Bay Area Atlas, you collect data to inform both practice and policy for community, centering the people. So when you think about that data, what are, you know, like what parts of the Atlas data tool actually most informs a person's experiencing food insecurity?
It's a great question. Okay, to extend the metaphor here. This is about where the pecs it's about where the pecs are going. This is plumbing school. So the Bay Area Equity Atlas and the National Equity Atlas, they're designed on the premise that a lot of this data around employment, around labor, housing, education, demography, it's readily available. It's put out by the Census Bureau, by the American Community Survey, by the state of California, county governments, but there's many different gatekeepers in terms of just the way that it's outputted is often very hard to parse through. It's very hard to figure out how to disaggregate the data by race or by gender or by income in ways that can make it more actionable for the ways that different communities actually experience inequity on a day-to-day basis. And in that regards, it's really thinking about how can we package it in ways that are more informationally available, more accessible, more readable. And I would say that there's 3 major components to that. One is around interactive data tables. So if you go to our website, bayareaequityatlas.org or nationalequityatlas.org for the national version, looking at the indicator tables that we have where you can change the geography from maybe county to city to individual census tracts, and looking at the change of over time of this data, or looking at the relative values for different communities of color versus say white communities in a given geography. And so being able to explore on a interactive basis what that actual inequality looks like in different areas around the country or around the region, as well as some targeted written reports and interactive dashboards where we take individual topics and guide the audience through those particular intricacies on a given matter. And then the third component would be around our actual like me here today, our community engagement efforts to make sure that we are working across the region, building those networks, deepening those relationships to be the rising tide that lifts all boats, so to speak. And so to answer your question, Lillian, I think in regards to how can we use the data in relationship to matters around food justice, food insecurity, I actually want to pose another kind of 3-part answer here. And the first I would think is really, and this actually thinking about, say, the question around how to access the benefits and just the way that the social safety net is set up, is making sure that we can use demographic population data to understand the intricacies of any given community, especially those with high rates of food insecurity. And I'm actually thinking here, prior to my time at PolicyLink in the Equity Atlas, I was working for the Mission Economic Development Agency, which is a direct services nonprofit based in San Francisco, in the Mission District, which is a historical Latino community. And what we saw there, especially in the middle of the shelter in place in the early part of the pandemic, was a lot of these barriers emerging around people accessing public benefits or finding a way to get to food banks. And a lot of that took a really deep dive in understanding from that ground perspective as well of what were the actual challenges at stake. Was it about linguistic isolation? Was it about actually people have a 3rd grade education and actually just need help figuring out how to navigate a bureaucracy and forms? Is it about people who come from a different political environment and may be suspicious of public systems together? And understanding both from here's who lives here from that top-down view, here's are the rates of linguistic isolation, here are the rates of immigration. That's often very important from a policymaker perspective. But then also, as I mentioned, making sure that we're hearing from community members, we're hearing from our direct services staff. Here are the actual challenges at stake. Here's where we actually need to think about refining our connection points within the safety net itself. So that's one way to think about data, is that we really need to know who lives in a given space in order to best reach the people who live in that space and who really need the help. The second I would think about data is more of an historical basis. And actually prior to the nonprofit world, I was in academia as a historian and ethnic studies scholar. And I really think the data here is important to understand the historical relationship between different spaces in a given region, and how that historical relationship is emblematic of the deeper legacies around capital disinvestment, around mortgage redlining, around segregation that create inequality, and how those entrenched legacies really bubble up in the current moment. And so thinking, for example, of the issue of food deserts, for instance, areas that lack adequate grocery stores or fresh produce. We can often understand those spaces in relationship to the larger histories of capital flight from places like Oakland in the post-war era, and the emergence of suburbs like Castro Valley or Fremont or Hayward, and really looking demographically at where people move over time, who lives in areas and how that changes, is also indicative of the ways that different spaces are or are not invested in and funded. Right. So food deserts are often places without banks as well, and those are absolutely emblematic of a deeper legacy of racial segregation here in the Bay Area, as well as everywhere in the country. And I think really understanding from that perspective, when we talk about food insecurity, we are often having to right the wrongs that we inherited as well, and what it means to not simply, just slap a sticker on it or a Band-Aid or a new face of paint, but what it really means to start from the foundation. And thirdly, I want to also think about the food systems, food injustice as another analytical lens, because food is ultimately one modality that we can think about our interdependence as people in a society. That food justice is a way to think about the relationship of people across space. And actually, I really appreciate evoking the farmers here. I am the grandson of a sharecropping family. My dad's dad was the son of Japanese immigrants in the Sacramento Delta region. And they lost everything in World War II because they were incarcerated, and moved to the Bay Area afterwards. And when I think about food, especially being in the Bay Area, really blessed to have such wonderful fresh vegetables and fruit everywhere, is again, who's picking the vegetables in the Central Valley, in the North Bay, and in Salinas? Who's driving? Who are the truck drivers driving the food from Fresno to Fremont, or from Modesto to Mountain View, for instance? Who is stocking the grocery stores, in the early morning? Who is preparing the food in restaurants? Who's washing the dishes? Can they afford to live in the communities where they are working, for instance? Do they have adequate transportation to their workplaces? All of those things matter in terms of how we think about food systems ultimately, and the ways that food itself and access to food is just one part of a larger system of life that's inherently connected. And so just really to really think about data, about research as that connective tissue in a way to drive better understanding for the sake of social change.
Thank you, Ryan. So continuing our pipe metaphor, Sarah, if you can share with us what the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequity is driving impact and innovation around, as you guys think about the larger ecosystem that's impacting, food security for families. What are some of the things that's bubbling up for you all that you think beyond kind of like what we've been talking about, or part of what we've been talking about, that you guys are thinking like, this is where we need to be going as a country from the lens of research that you sit in?
Thank you so much, Lillian. I think I'm really excited to talk about this idea of thinking beyond just food security to broaden that out to economic security more broadly. And I think there's two really key opportunities I think that opens up. So the first is that if we think about food insecurity as being the result of and embedded in a broader issue of economic security for a family or individual, I think one of the things that opens your eyes to is thinking about policies and interventions that are affecting other aspects of economic security and how those play out in affecting food security as well. So that makes you think about things like, well, rental assistance has nothing to do with food security on its face. But if you look at the data, think data between people receiving long-term subsidized help to ensure that they have affordable, stable housing, and how that connects to food security, you see actually there is a significant positive impact on how food secure people are. So if we care about food security, we should also care about housing security. Or similarly, I think about the expanded child tax credit. That was one of the most exciting policy innovations in the pandemic years. Again, not a food-specific policy at all, but one of the most important effects that we see in the data as far as how that affected people's lives was there was a substantial increase in food security for the households that received that child tax credit, particularly the advanced monthly payments. So again, not a food policy on its face, but actually it was a food policy, right? So I think that's a really one of the really powerful things about thinking about food security within that broader context of economic security. And I think the second window of opportunity that opens up is it really encourages you to think about, well, if we see innovations in these other areas that are addressing other aspects of people's basic needs, what does that suggest to us of things that we might be able to apply to address food security as well? So again, talking about the advanced child tax credit, for example, there were some unique ways about how that played out that are different from the ways that policies are often, benefits are often delivered to people. So things like, for most people, they received that credit automatically. They didn't have to do anything special to apply for it, right? It was based off of taxes they'd applied for filed in the past. So automatically the benefits were issued to people. They were, for many people, just deposited directly into their bank account as cash that they could spend on whatever they wanted, right? Whatever they needed to spend it on. Are there ways that we could, think about applying that to strategies to address food security specifically? It encourages you to sort of think about innovations in the broader economic security world and how they might have lessons to apply for addressing food security specifically. And so I think those are two really key opportunities that arise from looking at economic security more broadly as the sort of framework within that food security sort of sits within. I think a final thing I want to kind of point to is that I think it's also really important to think about economic security, not just at a moment in time, but kind of on a longer time scale. So thinking about economic security over an individual's lifespan, thinking about it intergenerationally, because this is the context that really is the upstream driver of economic security. So when we think about a longer time span of economic security, how secure is someone over the course of their life, then things like assets and wealth become really important to think about. And I know this is an area that, Lillian, you've thought about a lot, and that Deborah, your organization thinks about a lot as well. And when we think about assets and wealth, these are assets and wealth both buffer you from a moment of a crisis of economic security in a moment in time, which could lead to food insecurity, right? But so both as a buffer to help protect you against an immediate crisis, and then also creating the opportunity to invest, make investments that set you up for longer term, better economic outcomes and more stability over the long term. And so, and this is also an area where we really see, there are problematic and large racial and other gaps in income equality, right? But when we look at the gaps for across assets and wealth, it's overwhelmingly larger, right? So this is, again, one of the factors that is an upstream factor that drives the differences and the disparities and the inequities and experiences of food insecurity downstream, right? So, so I think it's also important to pay attention to innovations that are aiming to address those gaps in assets and wealth. And that's where things like baby bonds are one of the areas that the Sanford Center on Poverty and Inequality is really interested in. So I think, again, thinking that these kinds of policies are also food security policies, and these kinds of, thinking about policies and interventions that address these kinds of both the short-term economic security and the kind of long-term picture of economic security are really intricately tied into people's experiences of food security, and thinking about those kind of upstream factors and upstream strategies, I think is a really important part of the context for all.
Sarah, before you go on, I'll just take liberty to say I really appreciate your example of helping us to see that there's a tie between rental assistance and food security. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles. Hey, Mama, she's watching right now. And we were a recipient of HUD certified housing, and I never remember ever feeling food insecure. And that's a real thing. And I appreciate also what you said about that tie around the child tax credits. I think that speaks to what Francesca was saying about if we just make SNAP renewals easier, right? If we just change the policy or the administrative policy around families not needing to actually have to continue to renew, like more families would be and found themselves less food. So I just thank you for that. I know you guys are doing amazing work at the Poverty Center. So thank you for bringing that up to surface. And Trevor, here we go.
Back to the farm.
So you work at TerraClear, who's helping to solve some of the most pressing challenges farmers and food growers face through technology. Our team at Share Strength highlighted this stat, which I thought was just staggering for me. The World Economic Forum estimates a $15.2 billion funding gap for food systems innovation. But the work that you're doing is that you're trying to, solve that gap, right? So if you can just speak to us about what are the pressures that farmers face, and what is the opportunity if we really care about solving this issue? Tech companies such as yours, right? Could use additional support around X. Help us understand that a little bit about what you're doing with farmers and how that's reducing the cost, but also what other support do you need in order to actually address some of these gaps?
Good questions. So I'll start with an attempt to characterize the stresses that farms are dealing with today. There's so labor is probably the first thing that if you ask farms is a challenge. It's not labor availability, it's the cost of labor, and there is very limited labor in the United States, and we rely very heavily on migrant labor through the H-2A program to come into the US. So that's a huge one, and it's typically when we talk about, we work on a problem of rocks in farm fields, broad acre farm fields. They're typically done by hand. People pick them up, throw them in a tractor, or you're riding through the field, you get out and you pick them. And so we're systematizing that single operation for farmers. And there's a experience I had. I was in southern Idaho on a farm, and there were two folks that were on a tractor. We were demoing a product, and on the same field, on the other side of the field, were two men walking through, picking up pretty heavy boulders and throwing them in. And they sort of saw what we were doing, and in my brain, it was like an Enya song playing, and it was slow motion. Dropped the rock and walked over, and we're just sort of in awe of what was happening. And so that exact example, when you provide a solution like that, those two employees are now going to get redirected to do something much more valuable, much better suited for a human. And a lot of the exciting stuff that's happening, particularly I think around spraying and not exposing humans to a lot of the chemicals that are very widespread in large agriculture, not only replacing those, but taking the human out of that and giving them something that's more fitting. So that's one thing, labor. The second one is really volatility, weather, climate. These are huge things that farmers are talking about on a regular basis. There was an anecdote, a farmer said in a year of volatility in terms of corn and soy and wheat prices, in this case, it was corn and soy, they used to see about the same volatility in a year that they now see within a 2-week span. And I think that's moving in the direction of, and there's somebody in this room that can explain to me why that's so dramatic. I don't know. But it has a lot to do with, data flow and, crises here and there. And I do think weather volatility is something that comes up. So those are some of the constraints there. Now, what are we doing to solve those problems? I think I talked a lot about productivity earlier, and I think that's real. But what I'm very encouraged by is that farmers, what I'm encouraged by is that raising capital and really thinking about our company's strategy, the stakeholders involved in that are all talking about the climate. They're all talking about the soil. They're all talking about sustainability in an important way. And I don't know if they were a decade ago, but I have the impression it wasn't to the extent now. And so a farmer, however, has the challenge of, in their words, often they've got 40 shots to get this right. And their biggest fear is losing the farm. Mm-hmm. And farms are getting bigger. There are way more pressure on small farms to stay competitive. And so that's sort of the lens that they're looking at adopting these new technologies. And so we've got to understand that and meet them there. And I would argue that it's the role of investors, it's the role of entrepreneurs and engineers to think long-term and think about, okay, for example, carbon credits, right? A farmer says today, do I want to change my practices so that I can, reduce carbon, capture carbon on the ground? Yes, every single person would say yes. But that requires that they buy a new seeder. It requires that they change the cycle of their crops. It requires they learn how to use cover crops, which is maybe something that they hadn't ever used before. These are like massive, huge challenges. And so understanding where they are as investors and entrepreneurs, and being able to walk them into these better practices, I think is the framework that we really use.
So I'm gonna hold my last question to the end, but we're gonna open the floor up for questions because Julie, she's like, come on, we gotta ask some questions. Thank you so much, Julie. So we have a couple of questions. More press. Innovation is fast. Government is slow. Come on, question. How do you think about innovation and politics together?
I can start us off since this is kind of where we live. So really, I totally agree. This is a friction, I think, and a tension that we feel all the time. I think when I think about my bottom line, it's worth it to move a mountain an inch because it's a mountain. A lot of people don't have a choice about whether or not they're going to engage with government. And so to me, it feels really well worth it to focus on a solution that's scaled to meet the need and to push that to scale more quickly. I want to just tie some threads together about this. So during the pandemic, we came together and actually, like we said in the opening remarks, cut poverty by half, right? Or child poverty by half. That was unprecedented. It was amazing that in this crisis moment, we were able to make sure that people got the money they needed. There are some imperfections on implementation that we had to work through. I think the child tax credit is a great example. People who are low income don't necessarily have to file taxes, right? So how can we make it easy for them to file taxes? How can we automate based on what the IRS already knows about people to just not send you a tax return and say, is this correct? So I think I would push us to sort of remember what we can do when there is the will at the table. The other thing I think that is important is this policy and implementation. I think, God bless the folks who work on policies day in, day out. It's really hard work. Sometimes you do all of this to see something disintegrate at the end. But once a policy is passed, there is this implementation period, and that's in the whole other tranche of work that needs to start. And so focusing on that implementation piece where there actually can be a good amount of wiggle room for figuring out how these programs can be responsive to people, talking to people about their experience, using that to build the way that you implement things, using data that people are creating and using the process to then inform how you improve over time. I think that is a sweet spot that is a little bit underdeveloped. Any other panelists want to respond?
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to, when you had brought it up too, and I think what you're alluding to. So what did we do during the pandemic? We did universal basic income. Mm-hmm. We did universal health care. Food, we did through mutual aid. Food banks, people donated to food banks in record numbers. And we rely on food banks to distribute, right? It's our kind of distributional equity. And so that's where you saw the innovation in policy and politics just went out the door, and we just tested this stuff, right? Where everybody is locked in, got to get people money, and it wasn't restricted. It was we're just going to give you money. Right. You decide you got to buy medicine, you got to pay rent. We don't care, and people got through it. And then you want a vaccination, it's free. Pop-up clinics, you can get a drive-through, right? It was so, and it was that's where policy met innovation like nobody's business, right? And then children benefits. So I think there is incident, and it's terrible that you had to wait for a crisis for that to happen. And the other piece, because I want to add on sort of what's innovation, there's the idea of public land trusts, right? That the public owns some land that you can farm, right? And then that's that kind of instinct of the community to do mutual aid, right? So if we publicly own it and we publicly harvest, there's something in there. So the policy part is land trust to people. Mm-hmm. So because you have land, you gotta have a lot of power in America. The more land you have, the more power you have. But there's something in there about working with the farming community and land trust and seeding that to community that I think is innovative policy meets.
Any questions from the room?
Hi, Jess Bartholow from the California State Senate. I just wanted to lift up, I appreciate the conversation about how we were able to leapfrog some of our policy work during the pandemic because we had an emergency. And I want to also lift up that we did that in food. And a lot of people are not recognizing that work, and it endangers our ability to secure it nationally and ongoing and in a big way. And so just to lift that up really quickly, pandemic EBT, this was $10 billion of food benefits that was automatically given to any child who was eligible for free meals and went straight to them in the mail. They didn't have to apply for it. They just got it the same way the other benefits did. So I want to lift that up because that's something people had been working on for a long time, for about 10 years throughout the country through summer EBT pilots. It was something that in DC, they fought really hard against, the advocates in DC, the think tanks in DC, and it came out of California because we had so many immigrant kids that were going to be hungry, because we had an equity focus. And it took some really brave leaders and their partnership with Francesca's group to say, yeah, we can do it. When Pelosi said, if you tell me California can do this, we'll do it. And we don't care if the other states can't. And we said, yeah, they said they can do it because Alexis Fernandez over at the SNAP program, our CalFresh program, and Francesca's group said, we can do it. So I just want to lift that up. And then the second piece of food justice that was really important during that time that was universal free meals. Universal free meals was something that advocates have been working for a while on, and it became very quickly adopted during the pandemic, and in California we said, let's make it permanent. Again, organizations and think tanks in DC opposed it. They still have not all fully come on board. It's moving. We now have 9 states that have adopted universal meals. This is the same sense. You walk in, you don't have to fill out paperwork. You walk in the door, you get the food, and everybody gets the food. There's been a 500% increase for families in California that have gotten that. And it's about $350 per month per child that the families benefit from. So this is very helpful. There are about 20 states that have introduced it. The president now has said it's part of his plan to end hunger. We have movement nationally, but we need more support in academia, in think tanks, in the field. Families love it. We're really proud of it. So I just want to lift those 2 pieces up. I'm sure there's many more examples, but on food justice, they kind of are the gold standard. We did it and we're moving. The last piece is I'll just say we did take the pandemic EBT model and move it to a summer EBT. And California will be the first state in the country to implement that. It's only $40. We tried to make it $120. It's a federal benefit though, and it's about $600 million for California kids. Again, they don't have to apply. They don't have to do anything. They just get it. So I just wanted to lift those up in addition to the panel, and I really do appreciate the conversation. Thanks.
Jessica could not be a better spokesperson for this. And thank you so much. I think she added things that I could not have remembered in the moment, but also I want to add to that just in terms of what SNAP was able to do during the pandemic. Benefit allotments were raised tremendously. Everybody was brought to the maximum income, and then people who were at the lowest, once the Biden administration took hold, raised even further. We eliminated rules that bar college students, which are completely arbitrary and ridiculous and need to be removed. We removed racist work requirements during that time. So again, in this crisis moment, whoever has the plans and is ready to get to work is able to move things forward. And we've seen that in a million ways throughout our history, right? Who is there at the table with the plan when there's a shock to the system? So yeah, I just want to echo that, the food bank, and I've worked at a food bank. Food banks cannot absorb hunger in this nation. They are there to serve people who can't be served by government programs or who need more help. And that's the function. But we really need to invest in our government programs first as like a blanket approach. And then those food banks can come in and supplement. Food banks can't keep up right now.
Just want to plug the Share Our Strength that's actually on the front lines. Lisa Davis and Courtney Smith, my co-peer senior vice presidents, in trying to implement and pull for summer EBT. So that is something that we're committed to. I think that they would have kicked me if I didn't say that. Awesome.
Good.
Sure.
See, I was thinking about also just reading news out of Chicago where the mayor, Brandon Johnson, is proposing to build a government-run grocery store in the South Side. So in one of the historical food deserts. And that really excited me just as I'm thinking about, what can the public sector do in ways that are often unheralded, often maybe not as sexy, but rather like are part of that groundwork. And I think this is a both and here. I do agree that there is a lot of challenges about the public sector, a lot of red tape, or, a lot of the county agencies in the Bay Area are just understaffed severely as a structural issue. And yet I want to be careful because, in the US, we're on the tail end of generations of neoliberalization where we've privatized a lot of the safety net. And I want to be careful to avoid an easy assumption that we have to flee the public sector as a way to get things done. Yes, it's very important to think about, say, the roles that the private sector can drive automation in ways that are actually still human-centered. It's about, providing people better jobs, safer jobs, not about eliminating people's, wages, for instance. Or how nonprofits are very important in thinking about how to link public agencies to the people who are harder to reach. And at the same time, the goal still also has to be good governance, ultimately. How do we actually make these systems work and not simply assume that they're abandoned? Otherwise, we're going to lose public education in the next generation. So really important to fight for that and the commons as a need, as a good.
I was just gonna, if I could just add one little, just to the point of that link between innovation and ultimate policy change. I think what Jess's comment made me think about this too is just that there is so much power to both the research and data that shows that on a small scale something works, or on in an experimental way, so that you can see positive effects, and then the piloting things at the local level, piloting things at the state level to show that this can be implemented at scale, and sort of leading the way that showing that path to track. If we try this, these are the outcomes we get. If we implement this on a small scale, and then on a medium scale, at a state scale, this is what happens, and helping to build the case and provide the evidence that shows that this is something that can be done on a broad scale, on a large scale, and on an ongoing basis. I think is one of the ways that you can kind of draw the line between an idea that seems to have promise and something that actually is reaching millions of people on an ongoing basis in a way that's sustained.
I'm gonna open the floor for one more question, and I'm gonna ask one final question to our panelists. Oh, we have 2 minutes. Okay, sorry, David. We have 2 minutes. So the final question to our panelists, if you can just keep it to 30 seconds. As we close, can you share one audacious goal or aspiration that you hope will be manifested in your lifetime to improve food insecurity for families and communities?
Oh, man. Such an incredible question. I've been thinking about it a lot since you brought it up. For me, it's I hope that consumers continue to learn and understand and demand information about the food that we eat in a way that there's a transparency between the growers and the consumers of food and
I think it's important that we address urgency both in the short term and the long term. By long term, I mean climate crisis. Thinking about the global warming means for California's agricultural sector, or for just the people's ability to live. And really making sure that we are not losing sight of that long term challenge and crisis.
I would say that this is a bold goal, but I think it is actually achievable. That we would build a data system that would allow us to really clearly identify who is being reached by the support that they need and who is not. Where are the holes in our safety net? And that it would be designed in a way, with linked administrative data that would be granular enough and timely enough that you could use that information to really develop real-time policy solutions and interventions that would make sure that nobody falls to the cracks.
I mean, it's big, so I don't know if we'll get there, but a just economy that fills those gaps and allows us to use the technology and policies to be able to be access for everyone.
Mm-hmm. A dignified, pleasant experience so people can access all the safety net programs that they need, and that those programs actually meet their needs. In the short term, really excited about summer EBT and the possibility that creating a net new program can actually, help people eat through the summer times when things are challenging. So in the short term, that every state opts into summer EBT. I'm really delighted that we're putting a share of strength on that effort.
Thank you. And I'll close with saying my career has been in economic justice, and I am so proud to be working to bridge that field with a hunger field, because I believe hunger is an economic justice issue. So in the short term, we plan to help lead the narrative change movement around connecting those two worlds, those two advocates, those two politicians, those two funders, all the, the ecosystem. And in the long term, I hope that we can actually solve hunger, because I do believe that it's a solvable issue.
To save me from saying, well, what's your wish? Because we had to have it. I'm Corby Comer, Food and Society. You were really seeing, though, both Share Our Strengths logo and Food and Society full time, while our fantastic viewers were seeing this fantastic panel. I'm here with my partner in crime, Elliot Gaskins from Share Our Strengths. The every Thursday planning meetings we have for Conversations on Food Justice has been the best thing the pandemic produced. You can all have your nominees, but the best thing is our Conversations on Food Justice series, along with Faith, Julie, Mary, who have all been, and please, stand up and everybody applaud.
Elliot. I just want to echo everything that Corby said. We are so proud to be joining us with Food and Society at the Aspen Institute. At a time in our country where things can seem so divisive, the fact that we can have these conversations, challenge each other, and come to some common ground and understanding is so important to the work that we do. So we're very proud to do that. And I would just say, I heard President Obama say something recently that when we feel like we're alone, we get cynical, we despair. But when we feel like we're together, we can accomplish anything. After hearing this amazing panel, all of you in the room, all of you tuning in, we feel like we're going to have solutions to end the hunger crisis in this country. So thank you all for being with us today.